in paragraph 1, which should be focusing on wag the dog. So there's two, so the best way to do it is to actually split the essay in half in terms of looking at the following two ideas that we've already just talked about in the rubric, but they work really nicely as a split in your essay. So the first half you want to focus on is the representations of people's political motivations and actions. Okay, and just so you know for later, then you want to look at the next half being to do with the impact of those political acts, or the impact those political acts may have on individual lives or society more broadly. So that's what we talked about, the democratic process being abused, etc. But to start with, let's look at the representations of people's political motivations and actions. So, okay, so where you want to go with this is to have a look at I think that one of the best ways to do it is to have a look at the way that the president is represented, and how the representation of him is very much constructed from something that is going to be supporting him and his political motivations, which is to get re-elected, and then competing representations which will be more likely to support the other side. Okay, so there's actually three different perspectives we get on the president. So there's the public and then the private perspective, which both come from actually his side. Okay, so the public perspective on his side is going to be the one that says he's a great leader and he should be re-elected, etc. Then you have the private one where we actually see the truth about his indiscretions and sort of the moral, I'm going to say like murkiness, but it's kind of metaphorical, but the moral kind of ambiguity, or just the lack of morality really, in which he's operating, or his party is operating, in relation to covering up things that he's done that are obviously not going to portray him in a favorable light. And then you have the other competing representation, which is going to be the one from the opposing figure's side. Okay, so there's Senator Neal, who wants to get re-elected. Elected for the first time. So, vote Neal for president. So, of course, when something's going to be coming out about the current president that's going to be unfavorable, their side, Neal's side, is going to capitalize on that in order to satisfy their political motivations. Okay, so then we get all these three different representations going on. So the first one I'd focus on is the representation we get right at the very beginning in the really, really corny and tacky presidential campaign, the don't change horses in midstream. Okay, so, okay, cool. So what we get from that, and if you have a look at I've kind of included some screenshots in the notes as well. But what we've got right from the beginning in terms of, this idea of a horse, don't change horses in midstream. So clearly the president is being metaphorically compared to a horse, and how we think of a horse is, like a valiant, like a heroic animal. Okay, and so that's obviously the kind of qualities that they're trying to persuade us that the president has, which is why he should be re-elected. Okay, so that's the first thing. So lots and lots of examples you could possibly use. So you've got this tracking shot of the jockeys coming that have just come off a race or a practice or whatever. So if you have a look at the main guy who speaks and says that we should re-elect the president, or not change horses in midstream, he's wearing very much his costuming is very American. He's got the American colors on. So the overall you see very much a patriotic representation created of the president. Okay, so through the costuming, through what the characters say, we'll come back to that, and then at the very end of the ad, there's the American flag, and there's this really triumphant music in the background. So there's this idea that re-electing the president is in alignment with America's best interest and is very much a patriotic thing to do. Okay, so that's overall how it's represented. So in this shot that sort of has because you've got this conversation that happens between these two jockeys, and you've got like there's a very distinct height difference between them, and there's a way that they actually are shot. So if you look at that first one of the taller guy, there's a slight low angle shot putting him in a position of power, and he's kind of looking down at the smaller guy, and given that, you know, where they're looking at him from the perspective of the smaller guy, we're kind of looking up, like he's kind of looking down at us, you know. So in a sense that creates quite, I feel like it's almost like a paternal sort of image where he's, you know, advising us on the best thing to be doing, you know, with some sort of, you know, authority on the subject. Okay, so you've got this kind of close-up, low-angle shot of the taller jockey, which places him in a position of authority. Particularly in his advice, like my daddy always used to say, don't change horses in midstream. Okay, so, you know, the allusion to his daddy also really creates a representation of like tradition, and, you know, really appeals to that kind of traditional conservative values of the American people. Okay, so that's the first thing. Then you get the reaction shot of the, you know, the smaller jockey he just looks quite boyish and young, actually, so a little bit impressionable perhaps, but in any case he's very much comforted by that, you know. So, you know, you've got him, I mean, half his face is a little bit in shadows, but I would say he's pretty well lit overall. He's smiling, he looks really confident in that, and you know, and you've got him, see how he's kind of looking up at that guy like he's, you know, given some really great advice there. Okay, so you know, and he's agreeing, it sounds like a smart bet to me, you know, so you kind of get this sort of confidence that he has, and he's quite a likable figure. So, you know, he's sold on the idea of the fact that, you know, we should re-elect the president because, you know, this guy's suggested it's a great idea. And then, like I said, going to then the American flag, you know, and then on election day, re-elect the president. Okay, so very much patriotic. And then the music and so on. Okay, so that's the first representation of the president, which, as you can see, is extremely favorable with the intention or the motivation of the president being re-elected. Okay, so very much favorable towards him, and that is the selected, like as you can see, the way it's been filmed and written and so on is very much constructed to have people re-elect the president. Okay. It's very similar to the advertisement idea example I gave earlier on. Then you've got, after that, you've got a competing political representation from the private perspective, you know, which gives us a bit more of an insight into the kind of indiscretions that, of course, a campaign is not going to reveal. Okay, okay, cool. So one of the shots you can have lots of shots you can see in that private room. So I mean, the amount of time, my God, they take to like walk down to the basement really gives this whole idea of secrecy and you know, restriction, you know, so that's already the case. You know, you kind of get the whole panning or the tracking shot of like them following, you know, like being followed downstairs into the basement, and then they all go and sit in there, and then the guys who are making coffee kind of get sent out of the room because, you know, they don't have the clearance for it or whatever. In any case, they're being excluded, so they come in, they close the doors, and actually it's close the door to close on the camera, and then so you kind of get the sense again that there's a real private thing going on in that room, and then obviously we get to go into the room as well. But there's a very deliberate exclusion of the public through the way that is shot. Okay. So the lighting's really good in that scene in terms of creating very sinister atmosphere. So very harsh lighting. It kind of really illustrates or parallels with the sinister nature of what they're actually discussing. Okay, which is not whether or not the president has actually, you know, done what he's suspected or is about to be accused of doing, because frankly that doesn't really seem to matter. It's more about, okay, well, hold on, how are we going to do damage control here so he gets reelected? You know, but then there's just that whole construction of, you know, how do we now, regardless of whether or not he's guilty, because that's not important, how are we going to divert the public's attention from this indiscretion so as not to compromise the president's campaign? Okay. Okay, cool. All right, awesome. So we start then seeing this construction of, you know, a bomb and a bomb and like, you know, and we start seeing how the media actually gets their information to distribute to the public. Okay, so things like the media representative is going to be fabricating the fact that the president is sick, and therefore is grounded in China for the next day, so that these guys can figure out what to do. Okay, but you can clearly see that there is an outright lying manipulation that occurs in the media to favor what the president's agenda is. Okay, but from the perspective of the American people, they would have no idea what's really going on because they get the information from the media. So then you start getting these kind of moral problems that arise. Then you have the other competing representation of the president, which is from the perspective of the, was it Senator Neal? Yeah, right. So they've obviously, they've gotten wind of this story that's about to come out about the president disappearing with a Firefly girl for several minutes in the office behind the Oval Office, and now they're going to use that to capitalize on what their political motivation or agenda is, which is to get Neal elected. Okay, so having a look at their the campaign that they release, so you've got the voiceover. So the presidency is about honor, it's about principles, and it's about integrity. Okay, so a couple of techniques. You've got NAFRA, it's about, which I would suggest that the president is not about that. Okay, so he does not, the idea is that he does not encapsulate those particular qualities. And then you've got this sort of almost satirical song of the, in the background about thank God for little girls. So, that's a little bit, obviously with that idea that he has been unethical, immoral with this little girl, he clearly does not have honor, principles, and integrity. Okay, and then you've got this shot, and then particularly where it says it's about integrity, you've got this mid shot of, the empty chair at the Oval Office, implying that as with the fact that there's no one sitting in the chair, the president also does not have these qualities. So it's there's a sense that he is missing from not only the office and what his responsibilities are, but all those qualities that obviously the public would value in their president. So honor, principles, and integrity. And of course, given that the current president doesn't have those qualities, we should now elect Neal because he does encapsulate those qualities, as the campaign sort of implies. Okay, and then you have this shot of him, and it's a very nice looking mid shot of him, up straight in this very well presented suit, smiling, looking very trustworthy, etc. Okay, waving and so on. Okay, so then you get this kind of, through that juxtaposition of the immorality of the current president, then we're going to be more likely to vote for Neal. And of course, that's what his political motivation is, and why that campaign has been represented in that particular way, which is obviously totally competing with the initial campaign we get about, the horse in midstream. Okay, so look, there's lots of different examples of how you've got completing political motivations going on in the film. I haven't covered all of them, of course, but that should give you a pretty good idea of where to get started. You can use those ones, you can look into the film of other ones you want to use, but the main thing to actually make sure you focus on is that the political motivations and actions, or the representations of those, and then we'll look at the impact of that kind of construction in the second half. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there, and then we'll continue on with the next part after we do this one.